The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, the horizon a pale, unbroken line beneath the burning sun. I had lost track of the days long ago, each one blending into the next in a haze of heat and hopelessness. The makeshift camp was nothing more than a few tattered tents and rusty cages hidden deep within the wilderness. There was no sound except for the occasional gust of wind kicking up sand, and the muffled voices of our captors, who seemed to thrive on silence and fear. The man sharing my captivity, his name was Mark, though it felt strange to use names in a place where nothing seemed real, was a shadow of a person. His eyes were hollow, skin stretched thin across his bones, and he spoke in whispers, as if sound itself could invite punishment. He had been here for months before I arrived, and in that time he had learned that resistance was futile. I hadn't been here as long, but the weight of captivity pressed down on me just the same. I could feel the sand working its way into my skin, my mind unraveling with every passing moment. The captors were methodical in their cruelty. They controlled everything: when we ate, when we slept, even how long we were allowed to sit in silence before they decided to remind us who held the power. I didn't know exactly what they were planning, but the conversations I overheard hinted at something worse than the camp. They were moving people across borders, trafficking them into lives worse than death. The whisper spread through the camp that we would be moved soon. The captors spoke openly in front of us, knowing full well that it didn't matter if we knew. There would be no chance to escape once we were loaded into the trucks. Only a long, dark journey towards something unknown. That night, as the cold settled over the desert, I lay awake in the small space I shared with Mark. I knew it was our last chance. If we stayed, we were finished. I turned to him, speaking in a hushed, urgent tone. "We have to try tonight. There won't be another chance." He didn't respond right away. I could see the fear etched into his face. Fear of the captors, of the desert, of failure. He had already accepted that he would never leave this place. But I refused to give up. After what felt like an eternity, he nodded once, his expression unreadable. It was a silent agreement. We would try, even if it killed us. For the rest of the night, we watched the camp's every movement, waiting for the perfect moment. The guards were organized but not infallible, and as the deep hours of the night wore on, their attention started to wane. We had no tools, no weapons, just our wits and the cover of darkness. When the camp finally grew quiet, we made our move. Every sound felt amplified in the stillness: the scrape of sand beneath our feet, the soft rustle of fabric as we crept toward the edge of the camp. The fence that enclosed us wasn't much, just a patchwork of metal wire and wooden posts, but it was enough to keep us trapped. We slipped through a gap we had found earlier, the sharp metal edges scraping our skin as we squeezed through. Beyond the camp, the desert opened up like an endless sea, the dunes bathed in faint moonlight. The night air was sharp and cold, stinging our lungs with every breath. We moved quickly, every step sinking into the soft sand, making progress slow and agonizing. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound loud in my ears. I glanced back once, just once, and saw the camp shrinking behind us, nothing more than a dark smudge on the landscape. For a moment I felt the flicker of hope, but it didn't last. A shout rang out from the camp, followed by the sudden glare of flashlights cutting through the darkness. They knew we were gone. The moment the first flashlight beam swept across the dunes, adrenaline surged through me, wiping away the exhaustion and fear. Mark and I ran, our bodies moving on instinct, driven by the simple, desperate need to survive. Every step was a battle against the sand, which swallowed our feet and dragged us down. My legs burned, my breath came in ragged bursts, but I forced myself to keep going. The desert was a vast, unforgiving expanse, and the cold night air pressed down on us like a weight. Behind us, headlights appeared on the horizon, growing closer with every passing second. The captors were organized. They knew the desert better than we did, and they weren't about to let us escape without a fight. We pushed forward, knowing we had to find cover. The headlights danced across the dunes, searching for us. Then, just when it felt like we couldn't go on any longer, we spotted it, a dry riverbed cutting through the sand like a scar. Without hesitation, we dove into it, pressing our bodies against the cold ground, hearts pounding in our chests. The captors' vehicles roared past, their lights sweeping over the riverbed without stopping. We lay still, barely daring to breathe, as the sound of engines faded into the distance. For now, we were safe. But the night was far from over. When the sound of engines finally disappeared, we pulled ourselves out of the dry riverbed, our bodies stiff and aching from the cold. The night felt heavier now, every second stretched thin by the tension of knowing the captors were still out there, searching for us. Mark looked as exhausted as I felt, but neither of us dared to stop. The only way to survive was to keep moving, no matter how much our legs burned or how dry our throats became. The desert seemed endless, the stars above indifferent to our suffering. As dawn began to creep over the horizon, painting the dunes with pale light, we stumbled upon a small abandoned shack tucked into the side of a hill. The structure was weathered and half buried by sand, but it was shelter, and more importantly, it was hidden from view. Inside the shack, we found little more than rotted wood and broken furniture. But in the corner, half covered by debris, was a plastic container of water. I couldn't believe it at first. Water here, in the middle of nowhere. Mark and I shared what little was left in the container, the water stale and warm, but enough to keep us alive for another day. For the first time since we escaped, we allowed ourselves a moment of rest. But it was a fleeting reprieve. The fear of being caught loomed over us, and we knew we couldn't stay here for long. We left the shack just as the first rays of sunlight stretched across the dunes. The desert had become a new kind of enemy, no longer cold but scorching, with heat waves already shimmering on the horizon. As we moved, every step became harder, our bodies weighed down by exhaustion. Then we heard it, the low hum of an engine, carried by the wind. Panic shot through me like lightning. Mark and I exchanged a glance, and without saying a word, we split in opposite directions. There was no time to think or plan. The captors were close, and staying together would only make it easier for them to catch us both. I watched in helpless horror as Mark sprinted toward the far dunes, the headlights of the captor's vehicle locking onto him. The engine roared, and the truck sped after him, sand flying in its wake. There was nothing I could do. I turned and ran in the opposite direction, heart pounding in my chest, knowing that if I stopped now, it would all be over. The desert seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, the sun relentless as it beat down on me. My mouth was dry, my legs heavy, and my head throbbed with dehydration. Every step felt like a battle against my own body, but I kept moving, driven by the slimmest hope that somewhere out there, safety waited. Hours passed in a blur of heat and exhaustion. Just when I thought I couldn't go on any longer, I saw it. A town, small and distant, but real. It shimmered on the horizon like a mirage, and for a moment I was sure it was just another trick of the desert. But as I got closer, the outlines of buildings sharpened, and I knew I had made it. The last stretch felt like a dream, my feet dragging through the sand as I approached the edge of the town. My vision blurred, and my knees buckled beneath me. I collapsed by the roadside, my body too exhausted to move any further. A truck rumbled to a stop beside me, the door creaking open. I looked up, squinting against the harsh sunlight, and saw the driver, a weathered man with kind eyes, motioning for me to climb in. I didn't have the strength to explain or even thank him. I just nodded, and he helped me into the cab, offering me a bottle of water. I sipped the water slowly, feeling it trickle down my dry throat like a lifeline. The truck rolled down the highway, leaving the desert behind, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to believe that I was safe. By the time I reached my hometown, the exhaustion had settled deep into my bones. The familiar streets felt strange, like I was seeing them through a fog. I didn't know what had happened to Mark, whether he had been caught or had somehow escaped. It was supposed to be just another dull night, the same as every other shift at the lonely gas station tucked far off the highway. The hours dragged slowly, but I had grown used to the isolation. The store was lit by the flickering fluorescent lights overhead, casting a cold glow over the racks of chips and soda bottles. Outside, the night was empty, except for the occasional car passing by in the distance. I knew the rhythm by heart, The same old routine of sweeping the floor, straightening the shelves, and scrolling through my phone until my next customer showed up. Around 2 a.m., like clockwork, the familiar truck driver arrived. He always bought coffee and cigarettes, never said much. I counted on his visits to break the monotony, a strange comfort in the endless hours of quiet. But tonight, something was different. The trucker fumbled with his wallet, hands shaking slightly as if something was weighing on him. His eyes darted around the store, scanning the dark parking lot through the glass doors. He muttered something under his breath, grabbed his coffee and smokes, and left without a word. That's when I noticed his wallet still sitting on the counter. At first, I thought about leaving the wallet alone, but boredom got the better of me, and curiosity crept in. I flipped it open, expecting to find the usual, a driver's license, some cash, a couple of cards. Instead, tucked behind a faded photograph, I found a crumpled piece of paper. It was a list, handwritten, names scrawled in uneven letters. My heart skipped a beat when I saw my own name right there, near the top. Beneath it were other names I didn't recognize. My hands felt cold, and my mind started racing. Why was my name on this list? And who were the others? Before I could think it through, the soft chime of the station door interrupted me. A woman entered, moving slowly, her gaze sweeping across the aisles. She didn't look like a customer. Something about the way she lingered, hovering between the shelves and glancing out the windows, made me uneasy. The woman drifted through the aisles like she was waiting for someone. She didn't pick anything up, didn't browse like normal customers did. She just lingered, her eyes darting toward the glass doors, glancing outside as if she was expecting someone to appear at any moment. I followed her movements from behind the counter, pretending to be busy, but my unease grew with every passing second. There was something off about her. The way she kept checking the parking lot made me feel like I was being watched, not just by her, but by something beyond those windows. Then I noticed it. A car parked just outside, its lights off, engine silent. The windows were tinted too dark to see inside. It sat there, still as a predator waiting for its prey to make a mistake. A knot tightened in my stomach. Whoever was in that car wasn't here for gas or snacks. They were waiting. The silence stretched thin, making every small sound feel amplified. The hum of the refrigerator, the tap of the woman's boots on the linoleum floor. My nerves buzzed with the same uneasy energy the trucker had carried when he left. I couldn't shake the feeling that the night was closing in on me, pulling me into something I didn't understand. Then, without warning, the radio on the counter crackled to life. A burst of static filled the room, followed by a familiar voice, the truck driver. His words came fast, urgent, like he was running out of time. "Lock the doors," he said. "Whatever you do, don't open the door." The radio cut off with a sharp hiss, leaving me in stunned silence. My heart pounded in my chest as the weight of his warning sank in. I reached for the lock, sliding the bolt into place with trembling fingers. The woman noticed. She turned slowly toward me, her expression unreadable. And that's when the man in the car outside got out, moving toward the doors with deliberate, measured steps. He reached the glass and began pounding on it, sending sharp echoes through the quiet station. Trapped between the woman inside and the stranger outside, I felt panic rise in my throat. I was caught in the middle of something, and I had no idea what it was, or how I was going to get out. The pounding on the glass grew louder, each strike sending tremors through the thin walls of the gas station. I stayed frozen behind the counter, gripping the edge so hard my knuckles ached. The man outside leaned closer, pressing his face to the window, his expression hidden in shadow. I could only make out the cold gleam of his eyes, fixed directly on me. Inside, the woman stood in eerie stillness, her eyes calm and unreadable. She knew I was trapped, no way to call for help, no way out. The parking lot was empty, and the highway beyond it stretched into darkness. Even if someone drove by, they wouldn't notice anything unusual. The radio remained silent, the trucker's voice echoing in my mind. "Don't open the door." My heart pounded as I weighed my options. I could confront the woman, demand answers, or I could stay behind the counter, frozen with fear, hoping help would come. The woman tilted her head slightly, as if waiting to see what I'd do next. Outside, the man's pounding grew more insistent, his fists hammering against the glass with a rhythm that matched the beat of my heart. In a desperate move, I reached for my phone and dialed the only person I could think of, Sam, a close friend and ex-policeman. I whispered into the phone, explaining the situation as quickly as I could. "Stay where you are. I'm on my way," Sam said, his voice steady and calm. "Don't open the door. Don't talk to anyone. Just wait." The minutes that followed felt like hours. The man outside hadn't stopped. His pounding became more erratic, and his eyes darted toward the road every few moments, as if he knew something was about to change. Then I saw it. Headlights far in the distance, cutting through the darkness. Relief flooded through me, but the man outside reacted immediately. Without hesitation, he turned and sprinted toward his car. The engine roared to life, and in a cloud of dust, the vehicle sped off into the night. The woman inside didn't move. She stood quietly, watching the car disappear into the distance, her expression carefully neutral, as if none of this concerned her. Sam's truck pulled into the gas station moments later, his headlights sweeping across the empty lot. I unlocked the door quickly, letting him inside, my heart still racing from the tension of the last few minutes. The woman, still standing near the aisles, offered a weak smile, as if she just remembered how to perform normal human behavior. Sam gave her a hard, assessing look, his instincts sharp. "What are you doing here?" he asked, voice calm but edged with suspicion. The woman stammered, trying to explain herself, but her words came out disjointed and hollow. She claimed she was just passing through, waiting for a friend, but none of it added up. There was no urgency in her voice, no real explanation for why she had lingered in the gas station for so long. After a tense pause, Sam nodded toward the door. "You should leave," he said quietly. Without argument, the woman shuffled toward the exit. She cast one last glance over her shoulder, her eyes dark with something I couldn't place, regret, perhaps, or unfinished business. Then she slipped out into the night, vanishing as quickly as she had appeared. Sam stayed with me until dawn. The gas station felt different now, haunted by the strange events of the night. The silence was heavier, as if the walls had absorbed every moment of fear and confusion. The rain began as a drizzle but quickly grew into a downpour, hammering against the windshield in uneven bursts. I tightened my grip on the wheel, squinting through the wipers that struggled to keep up. The highway was out, flooded miles back, and I had no choice but to take these back roads. My GPS was useless now, showing blank spaces where the road should be, and all I could see ahead was the faint outline of narrow asphalt stretching between fields, swallowed by fog. The storm felt alive, the wind howling as it pressed against the truck, making every mile feel longer. I told myself I'd pull over soon, wait it out somewhere safe. But with nothing but fields and dark barns in the distance, safe seemed a long way off. The thought of spending hours alone on a back road like this made my skin crawl. I pressed on, hoping the rain would ease up before things got worse. Just as I was about to give up, easing my foot off the gas, something appeared in the beam of my headlights. A figure, waving their arms wildly, drenched and desperate. For a second I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, but the closer I got, the more real she became. She looked young, mid-20s maybe, her clothes clinging to her body, soaked through from the storm. Her face was a mask of fear, eyes wide and frantic. I hesitated, fingers drumming against the steering wheel. Picking up strangers was never smart, but leaving someone out here didn't sit right either. I leaned over and unlocked the passenger door. She climbed in without a word, dripping water all over the seat. As soon as she shut the door, she blurted out, "Just drive." Her voice was tight with fear, and she kept glancing over her shoulder like something or someone was coming after her. I pressed the accelerator, pulling away from the spot where she had stood, my mind swirling with questions. The road stretched endlessly before us, the rain blurring the landscape into shapeless forms. For a while, the woman didn't speak, staring out the window, her knees drawn up to her chest. I wanted to ask where she was headed, but something about her silence stopped me. She seemed more scared of what was behind us than where we were going. Finally, she started talking, her words tumbling out in a frantic, uneven rhythm. "The man back there, he's dangerous. I had to get away." I kept my eyes on the road, but I could feel the weight of her fear in the cab. "That your farm?" I asked, more to fill the silence than out of curiosity. She nodded, then shook her head. "I lived there, but I shouldn't have. It's not safe." We passed another barn, its silhouette barely visible through the mist. Just as I thought she was done talking, she whispered, "He's gonna look for me." I glanced at her, but she kept her gaze locked on the road ahead, her hands gripping the seat like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. A light appeared in the distance, a man standing on the porch of a farmhouse, holding a flashlight. The beam cut through the rain, sweeping over the road as if searching for something or someone. The woman's voice cracked. "Please, don't stop. Just go." I pressed the gas a little harder, and we left the man and his flashlight behind, swallowed by the night. The rain fell harder, and the windshield wipers struggled to clear the glass. I tried to focus on the road, but the woman's words kept circling in my mind. Her story didn't sit right. One minute she talked about the farm owner like he was a stranger. The next she hinted he was her father. I glanced at her out of the corner of my eye, but she seemed lost in her thoughts, mumbling to herself. I wanted to ask her what the truth was, but something told me I wouldn't get a straight answer. Instead, I kept driving, hoping the storm would pass and I could drop her off somewhere, anywhere, safe. But the road stretched on, and the storm only seemed to grow stronger, boxing us in with sheets of rain and swirling mist. The truck felt heavier than usual, like it carried more than just two people. Every passing minute made me more uneasy, and the thought that maybe I had made a mistake letting her in gnawed at me. "We're close," she whispered suddenly, breaking the silence. "Close to what?" I asked, but she didn't answer. She just stared straight ahead, her eyes wide and unblinking. I gripped the wheel tighter, unsure if we were running from something or driving straight toward it. The woman's cryptic words sat heavy in the cab, making the silence unbearable. I spotted an old barn in the distance, a shadowy outline against the mist. It wasn't much, but it looked sturdy enough to wait out the storm. I slowed the truck and pulled off the narrow road, rolling to a stop just outside the barn. "We'll wait here for the rain to ease up," I said, more to myself than to her. I glanced over, expecting some kind of response, but she was already fumbling with the door handle. Before I could say anything, she jumped out of the cab and vanished into the rain, her figure swallowed by the night. I sat there for a moment, stunned. I thought about calling after her, but stopped myself. Something about the way she left felt intentional, like she had been waiting for this exact moment to slip away. I stared out at the dark barn and empty fields beyond. The storm raged on, making the world outside feel distant and surreal. I had half a mind to leave, to just keep driving, but the thought of running blindly through the storm didn't sit right either. So I waited, hoping the woman would come back. I shifted in my seat, trying to shake the unease creeping through me. As I adjusted my position, my boot nudged something on the floor. I leaned down and picked it up, an old, worn photograph, the edges soft and frayed. It showed the woman, standing beside the man from the farmhouse porch. They were smiling, their arms around each other like family. But there was something deeply unsettling about the picture. The way they looked at the camera, their smiles just a little too wide, their eyes a little too vacant. The image felt wrong, like a frozen moment from a dream you can't quite remember. I turned it over, hoping for some clue, but the back was blank. My mind spun with questions. Who was she really? What was she running from? And why did she leave the photo behind? I placed the photograph on the dashboard and stared out at the rain, feeling more lost than ever. The storm raged on, and the minutes dragged into what felt like hours. I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see the woman walking back out of the darkness. But the road behind me stayed empty, until it didn't. A flash of light appeared in the rearview mirror. Headlights. At first I thought it might be another trucker trying to find a safe place to wait out the storm. But as the lights drew closer, an uneasy realization hit me. This vehicle wasn't stopping. It was coming straight toward me. Panic surged through me. I turned the key, the engine roaring to life, and pulled back onto the narrow road. The headlights followed, closing the distance with every second. I pressed the gas harder, the truck lurching forward through the storm. The road twisted and turned, and every time I thought I had gained some distance, the headlights would appear again, unwavering. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. The barn and the strange woman were long behind me, but whatever I was running from felt closer than ever. I drove for what felt like miles, the truck straining against the storm. The headlights stayed locked behind me, relentless and cold. My heart pounded, fear and exhaustion blending into a strange, detached calm. I knew I couldn't keep driving like this forever. And then, without warning, the chasing car stopped. One moment it was right behind me. The next, the headlights vanished into the mist. I slowed the truck, confused, my pulse still racing. The road ahead was empty, the storm still pounding down, but the sudden absence of those lights unsettled me more than the chase itself. I pulled over, gripping the wheel with both hands, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My mind raced, replaying the night's events, the woman, her strange words, the photograph, and now this. I looked in the rearview mirror again, half expecting the lights to reappear. But the road behind me was dark, and the rain continued to fall, indifferent to the questions swirling in my mind. We stood at the entrance to the tunnels, the stale air greeting us with a sense of abandonment. The rusted metal gate swung open reluctantly, as if warning us to turn back. But we were here for the thrill, just a group of friends looking for something to break the monotony of our nights. With our flashlights in hand, we descended into the darkness, the excitement buzzing between us like static. The deeper we went, the more the city above felt like a distant memory. The cold air wrapped around us, making every breath feel thicker, heavier. We laughed nervously, our voices bouncing off the concrete walls, amplified and eerie. The walls were covered in graffiti, colorful, chaotic scrawls that hinted at years of trespassers like us. At first, the silence was exhilarating, like we had found a hidden world that belonged only to us. We shined our beams in every direction, watching the light dance across the walls, enjoying the feeling of being somewhere we weren't supposed to be. But as the tunnels stretched on, the laughter faded, replaced by a growing unease. It wasn't long before the graffiti started to change. The playful, colorful tags gave way to messages that were more unsettling. Warnings and strange symbols covered the walls. Some of them looked almost ritualistic. One of us muttered that it was probably just someone messing around, but the joke fell flat in the heavy silence. The floor was littered with debris, broken glass, plastic bags, and, more disturbingly, syringes. Some still had needles attached, lying haphazardly in piles like discarded leaves. The sight made my stomach twist. This wasn't just an abandoned place. People lived here, people who had fallen through the cracks of the city above. As we ventured deeper, we noticed makeshift beds tucked into the corners, tattered blankets draped over cardboard boxes, the remnants of someone's attempt to make a home underground. It was the kind of place where the rules of society didn't apply, where desperation hung in the air like a thick fog. The deeper we went, the more it felt like we were being watched. Our flashlights flickered at odd moments, the beams struggling against the dense darkness. Every so often, we would catch movement out of the corner of our eyes, shadows slipping through the edges of our lights, too fast to identify. We tried to keep calm, but it was impossible to shake the feeling that we weren't alone. One of us suggested turning back, but the words were met with silence. No one wanted to admit they were scared, even though we all felt it. The sound of shuffling footsteps echoed faintly through the tunnel, distant but growing closer. We stopped in our tracks, hearts pounding in unison. We strained our ears, listening for any hint of movement. Then, just as quickly as it started, the sound vanished, swallowed by the silence. Our breaths came shallow and quick. The tunnels, which had seemed exciting at first, now felt oppressive, like they were closing in on us. And still we pushed forward, driven more by fear of looking weak than any real desire to explore further. We rounded a corner and saw them, figures huddled in the darkness, their gaunt faces barely visible in the dim light of our flashlights. They sat in silence, watching us with sunken eyes, their expressions void of emotion. It hit me all at once. We weren't just passing through an abandoned space. We had stumbled into someone else's territory. These weren't just random people. These were the kind of people who had nothing left to lose. A cold sweat broke out on my skin as the realization sank in. We needed to leave, and fast. We whispered among ourselves, trying to decide whether to turn back the way we came or find another way out. But every second we stood there felt like a second too long. The figures in the dark watched us without a word, their silence more unsettling than any threat they could have made. We tried to move quietly, hoping to slip away unnoticed, but our footsteps echoed against the cold walls, far louder than we intended. Every scuff of our shoes sounded like a warning shot, and I could feel their eyes following us as we retreated into the dark tunnels. We thought we were making progress, but every tunnel we took seemed to loop back into itself. The walls looked the same in every direction, and our growing panic made it impossible to remember the way we came. Each path we tried felt wrong, and the deeper we went, the more the air seemed to press down on us. Whispers rippled through the group, questions, curses, and half-formed plans, but none of them helped. Our flashlights jittered against the damp walls, illuminating the same trash-strewn corridors and strange messages that seemed to mock us. We started to feel like rats trapped in a maze we didn't understand. Then, we heard the sound we feared the most, shuffling footsteps coming from the path behind us. The same gaunt figures emerged from the darkness, blocking the way out. They stood like shadows, their faces pale and expressionless. The flicker of cigarette embers glowed faintly in the dimness, casting strange halos around their faces. We were cornered. The group of users had made no sound of approach. Just suddenly, they were there, and they weren't moving. One of the men stepped forward. His thin frame seemed brittle, but his movements were deliberate. In his hand, he clutched a jagged piece of metal, a broken shard of something sharp enough to cut deep. He mumbled something under his breath, the words slurring together, unintelligible. We froze. There was no telling what he wanted, or if he even cared who we were. His eyes were vacant, hollowed out by whatever life he had lived down here. And the others behind him were just as unsettling. Silent figures, waiting for something, their expressions unreadable. Our instincts screamed to run, but there was nowhere to go. The man with the metal shard stepped closer, his movements slow but deliberate, like a predator sizing up prey. Panic clawed at my chest. We were moments away from things spiraling into violence, and we all knew it. Then, out of nowhere, one of the other users, an older man with sunken cheeks, made a strange gesture. He pointed toward a side tunnel, his hand trembling slightly. He didn't speak, just kept pointing as if urging us to take the path. We hesitated for a moment, unsure if it was a trap, but the man with the metal shard didn't stop us. He just stood there, watching, as if the choice was ours to make. Desperation made the decision for us. We bolted toward the side tunnel without looking back, our footsteps echoing in the confined space. I kept expecting to hear them following, but no one gave chase. The only sound was the pounding of our feet and the thunder of blood in my ears. The tunnel twisted sharply, narrowing to the point where we had to move single file. Every step felt like we were diving deeper into the unknown, but there was no turning back. We didn't speak, afraid our voices would betray us to whatever else might be lurking down here. The air grew colder as we ran, and our flashlights bounced wildly with every step. For a moment, I thought we were being led in circles again, tricked into wandering endlessly through the dark. But just as hope began to slip away, we spotted it. A rusty metal ladder bolted to the wall at the end of the tunnel. Relief surged through me, but it was laced with doubt. Why had they let us go? And where would this ladder take us? There was no time to think. One by one, we climbed up into the unknown. The cold night air hit me like a slap the moment I emerged from the tunnel. The smell of rain and concrete filled my lungs, a sharp contrast to the stale air below. I climbed out and helped the others up, each of us moving with frantic urgency, like we feared the tunnel might suck us back in at any moment. We found ourselves in an alley, narrow, filthy, and forgotten, tucked between two crumbling buildings far from where we had entered. The city lights blinked faintly in the distance, but nothing about this place felt familiar. For a moment, we just stood there, gasping for breath, trying to comprehend what had just happened. The relief of being above ground was overwhelming, but it didn't erase the gnawing unease that lingered. We had escaped the tunnels, but we hadn't left the experience behind. The forest smelled of wet pine and damp earth as I stepped out of my car. The drive out here had been long, but I felt lighter the moment I crossed into the remote wilderness. I had packed everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, food, a book, and enough gear to last the weekend. The lake, with its calm waters and the dense trees surrounding it, promised exactly what I was looking for. Silence. No phones, no meetings, no distractions. Just me, the outdoors, and time to think. The old ranger at the park entrance hadn't seemed particularly welcoming. He mentioned offhand something about recent hiker disappearances, but when I pressed for more details, he just shook his head. "Be careful," he muttered before stepping back into the cabin. I had shrugged it off. After all, people get lost in the woods all the time. That wouldn't be me. I knew how to stay safe. By the time I found the campsite by the lake, the sun was beginning to dip low, casting a warm glow over the water. I pitched my tent near the fire pit, arranged my gear, and sat by the shore for a while, watching the still surface ripple occasionally with the breeze. The forest seemed untouched, as though no one had been out here for a long time. It was perfect. The first night passed without much incident. I read for a while by lantern light, enjoying the rare luxury of uninterrupted time. The sounds of the forest, leaves rustling, crickets chirping, and the occasional hoot of an owl, felt like a soothing lullaby. I zipped myself into the tent, laid back, and let the peace settle over me. In the morning, I stepped out into the crisp air, stretching as the lake glimmered under the first light of day. I felt refreshed, eager to spend the day hiking and exploring the surrounding trails. But as I knelt by the water to wash my hands, I noticed something that stopped me cold. Faint footprints in the damp earth, leading from the edge of the lake toward my tent. I stared at them, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. They were too small to be mine, and too fresh to be old. The thought of someone else being out here unsettled me, but I brushed it off. Probably just another camper passing by in the early morning. I shook the thought from my mind, determined not to let it ruin the trip. The second night, things began to feel off. I had planned a short hike and returned to camp by late afternoon. I gathered firewood and made dinner, enjoying the solitude as I watched the stars appear one by one above the lake. Everything felt right, until the next morning. When I stepped out of the tent, I immediately noticed something strange. My firewood had been rearranged into a neat stack, even though I hadn't touched it since the night before. The lantern, which I had left near my tent entrance, was now sitting by the fire pit, as if someone had moved it while I slept, and the tent zipper, closed when I fell asleep, was now half open. I stood there staring at the campsite, trying to convince myself that I was imagining things. Maybe I had been more tired than I thought and moved the lantern without remembering. Maybe the wind had somehow tugged at the zipper. It had to be something like that. I refused to let paranoia creep in. On the third day, the unease I had tried to ignore only grew stronger. I spent the morning wandering aimlessly along the lake, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. But the sense that something wasn't right clung to me like a second skin. When I returned to camp that afternoon, I found the object that would change everything: a worn, water-damaged book, placed neatly beside the fire pit. I hadn't seen it before, and it certainly hadn't been there the night before. Curious but cautious, I picked it up and flipped through the pages. The entries inside were brief but unsettling. They described solo camping trips just like mine, each recounting nights spent by a lake, hikes through the woods, and strange occurrences that grew more intense over time. But what chilled me the most was how each entry ended abruptly, as though the writer had been interrupted mid-thought. The final pages were worse. The last entry had no conclusion, only a few unfinished sentences and scribbles. And then, on the very last page, I saw it. My name, scrawled in uneven handwriting. The date next to it was from the previous day. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I stared at the entry, heart pounding. It made no sense. Someone had to be playing a twisted joke on me. But who? And how could they have known my name? I flipped back through the book, looking for answers, but there were none. Panic set in, thick and heavy. I threw the book to the ground, but the image of my name on that final page stuck in my mind like a thorn. I tried to calm myself, pacing the campsite, telling myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe someone had been out here watching me from the start. Maybe it was just an elaborate prank. But how did they know my name? The forest, which had once felt peaceful, now loomed over me, the trees closing in, casting long shadows over the campsite. Every sound felt too loud, every creak of the wood or snap of a twig sending shivers through my body. I needed to leave. I packed in a frenzy, stuffing my gear into my backpack without care for order. The book stayed by the fire pit untouched. I wanted no part of it anymore. I slung the pack over my shoulders, took one last look at the lake shimmering under the fading daylight, and hurried toward the trail that led back to my car. The trail, which had been clear the day before, now felt unfamiliar. Trees that I didn't remember seemed to have appeared overnight, and the path wound differently than I recalled. I told myself I was just rattled, but doubt gnawed at the edges of my mind. When I was halfway back, I came to an abrupt halt. A massive tree had fallen across the trail, its branches sprawled out like jagged fingers, blocking the only way forward. My heart sank. There had been no storm, no wind strong enough to knock over a tree like this. I stood frozen for a moment, my breath coming in shallow bursts as I scanned the forest around me. The sun was setting quickly, and with every passing second, the shadows grew longer. I had the distinct, unsettling sense that I wasn't alone. I felt eyes on me, hidden in the dense undergrowth, watching, waiting. The air felt too still, and the silence pressed against me, making it hard to breathe. There was no time to waste. I turned and ran back the way I came, my pulse pounding in my ears. If I could just make it to the car, I would be fine. When I reached the parking area, a fresh wave of dread washed over me. I patted my pockets, frantic, but the truth hit me hard. My keys were gone. I tore through my backpack, emptied every pocket, but they weren't there. With no other choice, I made my way back to the campsite. The walk was slower this time, fear dragging at my heels. I felt like the forest was swallowing me whole, the trees pressing closer with every step. My flashlight beam cut weakly through the dark, barely holding back the night. When I finally stumbled back into camp, I froze. A small fire was burning by the pit, the flames crackling quietly. I hadn't lit it. Someone else had been here. Then I saw it, the book, lying open by the fire. I took a cautious step closer, and my breath caught in my throat. This time, my name was scrawled on the final page, with today's date beneath it. The sight of it sent ice through my veins. Whoever or whatever was doing this knew exactly where I was, and they weren't finished yet. I didn't think. I acted. I snatched the book from the ground and hurled it into the fire, watching as the flames licked at the pages, curling them into blackened ash. The words, the entries, my name, all of it burned away. As the book disintegrated, a glint of metal caught my eye. My keys. They were lying by the fire pit, as if someone had placed them there deliberately. My heart pounded, and every instinct screamed at me to grab them and leave. I snatched the keys, shoved them into my pocket, and sprinted toward the trail without looking back. The forest seemed alive with movement, shadows flickering at the edge of my vision. But I didn't stop. I ran harder than I ever had, the weight of the dark pressing in on all sides. When I reached my car, I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so badly it took me several tries to unlock the door. I threw myself inside, started the engine, and drove off without hesitation, the tires kicking up gravel as I sped away from the forest. The idea for the road trip was mine, one of those last-minute, spontaneous decisions that drives Katie crazy. She likes to plan every detail down to the minute, but I convinced her this time would be different. "Let's just go," I'd said. No itinerary, no reservations, just the two of us and the open road. I thought it sounded romantic. She thought it sounded reckless. The first few hours had gone smoothly enough. The highway stretched ahead in long, quiet miles, and for a while, it felt like the road belonged only to us. The sky turned from blue to bruised orange as the sun sank behind distant hills. By the time night wrapped around us, the thrill of the adventure began to wear thin. Katie kept glancing at the GPS, mumbling about how we should have stopped before dark. I told her not to worry, we'd find somewhere soon. But the road seemed endless, and the scattered towns we passed through were little more than clusters of dim streetlights and abandoned storefronts. I kept driving, a little longer each time, convincing myself we were just a few more miles from something promising. When the gas gauge dipped below a quarter tank, I admitted we needed to stop soon. The nearest station was still 30 miles out, just a blip on the GPS in the middle of nowhere. Katie sighed, but didn't say, "I told you so," which was merciful given how often she could. The highway narrowed, the night pressing close around us. A sign loomed ahead: gas, food, restrooms, and beneath it, a flickering arrow pointed toward an unlit exit ramp. It was the only option. We took it. The gas station looked like something out of a forgotten decade. A couple of yellowed fluorescent lights buzzed over the pumps, casting sickly halos that barely pushed back the darkness. The store itself had a cracked glass door, and one of the windows was boarded up. I could see the shelves inside, sparse, with random items scattered like an afterthought. Katie shifted uneasily in her seat. "Are you sure this place is open? It's on the GPS," I said, as if that made it better. I pulled up to the pump and cut the engine. She stayed in the car while I stepped out into the cool night air, trying not to notice how quiet it was. There wasn't another car in sight, just the two of us, the gas station, and the long stretch of highway fading into darkness. A figure stirred inside the store. The attendant, an older guy in a dirty baseball cap, stood behind the counter, watching us through the grimy glass. His gaze followed me as I swiped my card and began pumping gas. Something about the way he looked at us felt wrong. But I shook it off. People get weird when they've spent too long in places like this. The pump chugged along slowly, and I kept an eye on the gauge. Katie hadn't moved from the passenger seat, her phone glowing in her hands as she scrolled, probably checking for the nearest motel. That's when I saw it. The clock on the pump read 10:58 p.m., and just below it, a small, faded sign caught my attention. No service after 11 p.m. The pump sputtered once, then stopped abruptly. I checked the gauge, half a tank. I tried to restart it, but the machine stayed silent, as if it had already decided we weren't getting any more fuel tonight. "Half a tank," I muttered, pulling the nozzle out and placing it back. Katie leaned out of the window. "What's going on?" "They cut it off," I said, jerking my thumb toward the clock. It was now 11:01 p.m. She frowned, a nervous look flickering across her face. "We should go," she said, her voice low. I didn't argue. Something about this place was getting under my skin, too. I slid into the driver's seat and turned the key. Nothing. I tried again, pumping the gas pedal. The engine whined but refused to catch. Katie shifted beside me, clutching her phone as if it were a lifeline. "The car won't start?" "Not yet," I muttered, more frustrated than concerned. But with each attempt, the pit in my stomach deepened. I glanced toward the gas station. The attendant was still behind the counter, his expression unreadable. I could feel his gaze even through the glass, a weight pressing down on us. Katie tapped my arm, her voice sharp. "Ethan, we need to leave." I nodded, wiping my hands on my jeans, and we both got out, deciding to push the car a few feet down the driveway. Maybe we could get it to roll start. Anything to get away from here. We strained against the car, shoving it out of the driveway as the tires squealed against the gravel. The car groaned but rolled, and after a few attempts, the engine coughed to life. Relief flooded through me as I jumped back into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut. But then, just as I was about to hit the gas, the station door creaked open, and the attendant stepped out. He held up a pair of jumper cables, his smile too wide, as if it wasn't meant to be friendly. "You need a jump?" he called out, his voice scratchy. Katie grabbed my arm. "Ethan, let's just go. Now." I nodded, shifting into gear. Something about the way he stood there, those jumper cables hanging like a noose, made my skin crawl. But before I could pull away, I saw something inside the station that made my stomach drop. Through the window, just behind the counter, was a wall. A hidden wall filled with rows of car keys, each one tagged and organized. It looked like some kind of twisted collection. Katie gasped beside me. I followed her gaze to the cracked bathroom window. Inside, reflected in the broken glass, was her backpack, sitting on the floor. The same backpack she had left in the car. A cold, sinking fear settled over me. We had to get out, now. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel. my heart racing in time with Katie's shallow breaths. Without a second thought, I jammed the gear shift into reverse and backed out of the gas station's driveway. The gravel crunched loudly beneath the tires, and for a terrifying moment, I thought the car would stall again. The attendant didn't move. He stood at the edge of the lot, cables still dangling from his hands, watching us with a look I couldn't decipher. His expression wasn't angry. It was expectant, as if waiting for us to fail. "Go," Katie urged, gripping the seat as I slammed the car into drive. The tires squealed against the gravel before catching traction, and we shot forward into the highway. I didn't look back, but in the rearview mirror, I saw the gas station's flickering lights blink off, one by one, until only darkness remained. For the next hour, we drove in silence, the tension in the car thick and suffocating. My hands stayed locked on the wheel, and Katie stared out the window, her body rigid with fear. I couldn't shake the feeling that the station was still out there, waiting just beyond the horizon, even as the miles stretched behind us. We found the diner just as exhaustion began to settle in, a glowing oasis at the edge of the highway. It was old but clean, with neon lights humming softly above the entrance. I pulled into the parking lot, grateful to see a few other cars parked nearby. Katie and I slid into a booth, the bright fluorescent lights inside the diner feeling almost too harsh after the darkness we had left behind. As we waited for the waitress, I checked the fuel gauge, expecting to see it drop from all the miles we had covered. But the needle hadn't moved. Half a tank. Exactly where it had stopped at the gas station. Katie noticed it too, her eyes widening. "That's impossible," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't have an answer. I turned the key again, watching the needle hover unwaveringly at the halfway mark, as if the drive had never happened. My mouth went dry. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words felt too heavy. When the waitress came to take our order, I tried to sound casual. "We stopped at that old gas station a few miles back. Strange place." The pen in her hand stilled midair. She glanced around, as if checking to make sure no one was listening, then leaned in closer. "You mean the one down the highway? That station's been shut down for years." Katie's grip tightened around her glass. "Years?" I asked, feeling the ground shift beneath my feet. The waitress nodded. "The owner was involved in some bad stuff. People said he collected things, keys, personal items. Some folks went missing around there and he was accused, but nothing ever stuck. He just disappeared. No one's used that place since." Katie and I exchanged looks, the air between us thick with unspoken fear. The memory of the car keys lined up like trophies flashed in my mind, and I felt a cold dread settle in my chest. We left the diner without eating. I didn't care how tired I was. I just wanted to put as much distance between us and that gas station as possible. As I pulled onto the highway, Katie stayed silent, her hands folded tightly in her lap. It was supposed to be just another night, another thrill to break the monotony. My friend and I had a thing for finding places no one dared to go. Abandoned buildings, forgotten corners of the city, those were our playgrounds. There was something addictive about the silence and decay, the sense of stepping into a world left behind. That night, we had heard about a place, a building in a part of the city most people avoided, even during the day. It didn't have a name, just rumors. Stories whispered about squatters, attics, and things better left unseen. We had laughed it off. It wouldn't be the first time we walked through ruins, only to find old graffiti and piles of trash. We made our way through the cracked streets, the city shrinking into shadows around us. Streetlights grew sparse, and soon the only light came from our phones and a distant moon struggling to cut through the night. When we found the building, it looked like a skeleton, hollowed out, leaning into itself, as if time had finally started to swallow it whole. The door was already ajar, sagging on broken hinges. My friend gave me a look, half excited, half nervous. I knew the feeling. It was why we kept doing this. There was always that tension, the sharp edge between curiosity and fear. We slipped inside, flashlights cutting narrow beams through the dust-filled air. The adventure had begun. The building smelled like old rain and forgotten things. Plaster crumbled from the walls, and the floor crunched beneath our shoes. Broken glass, scattered debris, things that once had meaning but were now just trash. We moved carefully, our flashlights scanning graffiti-covered walls, names, symbols, declarations of love left behind by others. It felt familiar, almost comforting. But the deeper we went, the more unsettling it became. There were signs, small, easy to miss at first. A crumpled blanket shoved into a corner, empty soda cans arranged in a line, a sleeping bag draped over a rusted chair. This wasn't just a place people passed through. Someone had been living here. I caught my friend's eye, and we exchanged a glance, uneasy but unwilling to turn back. We pressed on, deeper into the dark. That's when we saw them. Syringes, scattered like brittle bones across the floor. Some still had needles attached, glinting in the light. My throat tightened. This wasn't graffiti and broken bottles. This was different. The air felt heavier, pressing against my chest. We kept walking, slower now, each step more cautious than the last. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears. Somewhere in the distance, something shifted. A scrape, a shuffle, just enough to remind us that we weren't alone. We turned a corner and entered a large, open space. It must have been an office or a meeting room once. Now it was filled with shadows and decay, and people. They were sitting against the walls, sprawled out on stained blankets and mattresses. A handful of them, eyes sunken, faces gaunt. They looked at us as we entered, their gazes sharp and suspicious. We had walked straight into their world. For a moment, no one moved. It was the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl, a silence waiting to explode. I felt my friend shift beside me. "We should go," I muttered under my breath, already turning toward the door. But it was too late. One of them stood, swaying slightly, and the others followed. They weren't just watching us now, they were advancing. "Wait," I tried to say, holding up a hand, but the words came out wrong, tangled in fear. The tension snapped like a wire pulled too tight. Angry voices filled the room, whispers turning to shouts. The next thing I knew, we were running. The building was a labyrinth, every turn a guess, every hallway a gamble. We sprinted through the darkness, flashlights bouncing wildly in our hands. The drug users were right behind us, their footsteps heavy, their shouts echoing off the crumbling walls. In the chaos, my friend veered left, down a narrow corridor. I hesitated for a second, just 1 second, but it was enough to lose sight of him. I took the next stairwell I saw, the rusted metal groaning beneath my weight as I stumbled downward. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breath burned in my throat. The walls closed in as I descended, the narrow stairwell swallowing the sounds of the chase. For a moment, it felt like I was falling, the air thick with dust and fear. But then I saw it, a door at the bottom, slightly ajar. I shoved it open and burst into the night. Cold air hit me like a slap, sharp and unforgiving. I doubled over, gasping, my lungs struggling to catch up with the sudden shift from stale air to fresh. Relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. My friend was still inside. I looked back at the building, its windows dark and empty, the night swallowing it whole. For a moment I stood there, paralyzed by indecision. I knew I couldn't go back in, not alone. But leaving wasn't an option either. I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. Not away from the building, but toward the city. Toward help. Toward the nearest police station, hoping, praying that I wasn't already too late. The police station was a blur as I stumbled through the door, my breath ragged and heart racing. An officer at the front desk looked up, and before I could even finish my explanation, he was already on the radio, calling for backup. They didn't waste any time. A team of officers geared up, loading into their patrol cars, and I found myself in the back seat of one, speeding toward the abandoned building I had just escaped. The ride back was a nightmare of second-guessing and guilt. I kept seeing my friend's face, hearing the sounds of footsteps closing in, wondering if he was still alive, or worse. The flashing red and blue lights carved streaks into the night, but they did nothing to cut through the fear gnawing at my gut. When we arrived, the building loomed even darker than before, as if the windows had swallowed the last bit of moonlight. The officers moved in quickly, flashlights piercing the shadows as they spread out through the decaying halls. I stayed by the cars, my legs too weak to follow them inside. The minutes dragged, each one heavier than the last. From outside, I could hear the officers shouting commands as they navigated the building. Their flashlights flickered through broken windows, sweeping across walls marked with graffiti and debris. Every creak of the floorboards, every shuffled step, sent chills through me. I imagined the addicts lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. The police cleared the rooms methodically, their voices growing fainter as they moved deeper inside. Occasionally, I caught snippets. Clear. Nothing here, but no signs of my friend. And then came the call. Found him! I felt a mix of relief and fear flood through me, the two emotions tangled together so tightly I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. They had found him, but I didn't know if that was good or bad. The officers emerged from the building with my friend in tow. His clothes were rumpled, his face pale, but he was alive. They had found him tied up in one of the back rooms, surrounded by piles of rubbish and the lingering scent of stale smoke. He wasn't hurt, at least not physically, but he looked shaken to his core. I rushed over, relief washing over me as I grabbed his arm, steadying him as he stumbled out into the night. There was no sign of the addicts, just the remnants of their presence. The officers found used needles, cigarette butts, and scraps of clothing, but the people themselves were gone. It was as if they had vanished the moment the police arrived, leaving nothing but their ghosts behind. The ride back to the city was a silent one. My friend stared out the window, lost in thought, while I tried to wrap my mind around everything that had happened. We were safe now, but the sense of unease lingered, clinging to us like smoke from a fire that hadn't quite burned out.